Let me start immediately from a few lines taken from Horace's Satires, first book, Satire 10. Atquego cum graecos facerem natus mare citra, versiculos, vetuit metali voce quirinus, post mediam noctem visus cum somnia vera. Insiluas non ligna feras insani usaxi, magnas graecorum malis implere cateruas. These are the words that, according to Horace, Quirinus, the deified Romulus, said to him in his youth, warning against writing Greek verse. These lines, in other words, reveal that composing Greek verse could appear absurd to a Roman, like carrying wood to a forest. Nevertheless, our evidence attests, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that from the early 1st century BC onwards, the Romans commonly wrote poetry in Greek. And in fact, several Roman poets found a place in the Greek anthology. In particular, for example, in the Garden of Philip, over 1/3 of the poets bear Latin names. And this proportion seems to be maintained in the later stages. So how is this consistent with what Horace says? In order to answer this question, I think we must ask a preliminary question, which is how can we detect the Latin native speakers and writers among the epigrammatists of the Greek anthology? Well, the value of Roman names and ethnics in proving the Roman origin of the poets is hardly conclusive for a double reason. First of all, because the collectors do not indicate an ethnic systematically and are not consistent in combining names with ethnics within the anthology. And second, because we cannot discern with certainty whether the Roman names belonged to Greek-speaking Easterners or to natives of the western parts of the Roman Empire. This is why, at least for the purpose of this paper, I have found it more reliable to start from a few epigrams whose authors are well known as bilingual writers, because they did actually write both Greek and Latin texts. The resulting corpus is a very small one, and it must be regarded as just the starting point of a journey throughout the Greek epigrams composed by Romans. What is interesting is that you can find in the handout that has been kindly distributed 14 epigrams, which can be ascribed to 5 authors. Well, most of these authors, 4 out of 5, are emperors and members of the imperial family. But let's go through their names first. Epigrams number 1 and 2 in your handout can be ascribed to Germanicus. The second epigram in particular is introduced by the corrector of the Palatine anthology without an alternative and contains an allusion to the dog star, which appears as a sort of sphragus, given Germanicus' familiarity with the stars as the translator of Aratus' astronomical poem into Latin. And these 2 epigrams work as companion pieces. I mean that the reader is presumed to know one in order to understand 2. They complete each other. So the same authorship can be assumed for them both. The second author that you can find in your photocopies is the Emperor Trajan, whose literary activity is basically unattested except for his Latin letters to Pliny. And nothing in this epigram, which is number 3, as I said, in the photocopies, nothing in this epigram reminds us of the emperor. So exactly these conditions argue, in my opinion, against the false ascription. I mean that since nothing in this poem would have prompted a reader to think of Trajan Probably no reader would have thought of attributing this poem to him if this poem had been anonymous. Epigrams from number 4 to number 10 are ascribed to the Emperor Hadrian, who is the most prominent of the Roman Philhellenic emperors. Hadrian's name, indeed, occurs not only in the Greek anthology but even in inscriptions. And the next one is Tiberius. Epigram number 11 can be ascribed to him. Although this ascription is problematic, it is debated to some extent. I cannot go into the details now, but if you are interested in this topic and in this epigram in particular, we can go back to it during the discussion. This epigram, in fact, is ascribed to Tiberius by Hesychius alone. The other sources prefer either Germanicus or Hadrian as authors. And I think that we can agree with Page that Hesychius must have a strong reason for preferring Tiberius, because one wouldn't readily think of him in this connection. And we know from Suetonius that Tiberius wrote Greek poems in imitation of poets such as Euphorion, Rhianus, and Parthenius. The very last author in this small series is Horace. We started from him and from his attempt to distance himself from his juvenile Greek verses. Well, in the Greek anthology, 17 epigrams bear the name of a certain Flaccus, which in Greek sounds as either Flaccos or Phalacos. Francesco della Corte, the Italian scholar Francesco della Corte, demonstrated that at least 2 of these epigrams, which are printed as numbers 12 and 13 in your photocopies, can be ascribed to Horace. This ascription has been corroborated by Enrico Livrea, who detected the Greek models of epigram 12 and found further proofs for the ascription. I think this ascription is extremely intriguing, and I couldn't find so far any serious objection to this ascription. But let me just add briefly that Francesco della Corte didn't take a stand on one epigram which is ambiguously presented as a Phalacou in the Greek anthology and which is printed in your handout as number 14 with a question mark immediately after this number, as you can see. This epigram is a dedication of a backhand's trappings and is different, in my opinion, from the epigrams transmitted as works by the epigrammatist Phalecus. In particular, as Page observes, the elaborate style of this epigram is characteristic of the followers of Leonidas of Tarentum. In this respect, what is the subject of epigram 12, which is the brutal description of a boy decapitated by river ice, would not be inconsistent with such taste. So, I mean that if we accept the ascription of epigram 12 to Horace, I wonder whether we can exclude Horace's authorship for this poem too, but this is just a question. I have no answer. I couldn't find an answer so far, so I ask this question and I share this question with you. And if you have an opinion about this, I will be really delighted to know it, and not only today, but also in the next future. Well, this is the very small corpus, and these are the authors. In such texts, quality varies as well as language, style, and themes. And although this is a very limited corpus, it raises several major questions concerning literary bilingualism and border crossing, basically. During this short presentation, I cannot go into the details and I cannot read the text, unfortunately, so I'll just make a few remarks on these major questions. But before going to this, let me say just something about the language. Which Greek is this? Our authors seem to be aware of the multi-faced nature of Greek language. They demonstrate a good command of Greek, including its literary varieties, and the vocabulary covers a wide range of possibilities from a relatively plain word choice in, for example, Trajan's epigram, in Hadrian's epigrams, and Tiberius' epigram, up to a more poetic lexicon that Germanicus and Horace in particular seem to be at home with. As a general rule, a writer's first language may influence his second language, and this influence is best called interference. As far as I can see, nothing similar can be found in these epigrams, but some slight oddities can be noticed in the use of language, grammar, and prosody. These features do not certainly allow us to disregard these poems as works by imperfect learners of Greek. But they hint at most that these writers were not Greek native writers. But let's pass now to the most important perhaps, or the main question, which is why these authors chose Greek for composing these texts. So, the language choice, in other words. Are we dealing with just products of a literary game played by Roman high society in order to demonstrate a good command of Greek? I think there is perhaps something true in the view that composing Greek verse, Greek poems, was a game played by Roman high society. But I think this explanation is not completely satisfactory. The factors that may influence language choice can be connected with three elements, basically. The literary product, first, including the literary genre, themes, sources, the intended reader, and the author. As for the literary product, the language choice is actually made through the choice of genre and theme, because the author is certainly committed to the traditional language use of each literary genre. So the real question is, which themes and subgenres are handled by such distinguished Romans? Besides the major and most traditional epigrammatic subgenres, such as dedicatory epigram and funerary epigram, these texts deal with a few of the most successful subjects in the early Roman Empire. So, we have got epitaphs on animals, which are numbers 1 and 2, one Scoptic epigram, which is number 3, and at least one erotic epigram, which is number 13. Epitaphs on animals are basically a legacy of Hellenistic poetry, a legacy which proved to be very productive in the Roman Empire, from Catullus to Martial, passing by Greek and Latin inscriptions coming from Rome and the surrounding area. The animal's death was mourned by the Romans, following a genuine Greek tradition. In particular, Germanicus' epigrams concern a dead hare killed by dogfish. And they share a Hellenistic taste for the detailed and vivid description of the adventurous death of animals. An excellent example was given 2 days ago by Andre with the 2 3rd century BC poems on the Indian dog Tauron. Such taste belongs specifically to the Greek literary tradition, and Latin epigram, on the contrary, Martial first, tends to develop a different type of epitaph for animals, which is the ironic and parodic type of epitaph for animals. Therefore, I think it should be no surprise that Germanicus composed these epigrams in Greek, because the literary subgenre seems to call for Greek. As I said, number 3 is a Scoptic epigram, which makes fun of a man with a long nose. In this case, the parallels are mostly Greek, and Scoptic epigram, as such, is extremely successful and develops within the Roman context and as a language, as a Greek language, phenomenon. So the use of Greek language once again by Roman writers is not surprising, but it is meaningful, especially in the 2nd century AD, after Martial's experience. The only erotic epigram in the series is number 13, which looks a very short epigram, which looks back to the best Hellenistic tradition for theme and concision. As for the funerary epigrams, they are numbers 5, 7, 10, and 12 in the small collection. 5 and 7 mirror perfectly the Hellenistic taste for fictional epitaphs of well-known people. In fact, they celebrate Archilochus and Pompeius respectively, while epigram 10 is the inscription from the tomb of the Greek poet Parthenius, an epigram composed by Hadrian, who restored the monument of this poet when it had been destroyed by floods. Parthenius was a Greek poet living in Rome, and he played an important role in introducing Greek poetry into the Roman 1st century BC high society, and his lasting fame is proved by this epigram. The language choice seems to be here influenced by the dead person celebrated, who was a Greek poet. Epigram 12 is closer to another Hellenistic type of epitaph, characterized by the moving and tragic report of accidents occurred to children who died an untimely death. One of the best examples was offered yesterday by Richard's paper. I refer to Poseidon's epitaph of Archianax. So let me just remind you that some intriguing connections between Poseidon and Horace have been observed in the last, let's say in the past time, the last few years, but also before the discovery of the new Poseidon's texts. Well, all these epigrams look back to a genuinely Hellenistic tradition, hence the choice of Greek language. But chronology is crucial, I think, in making this choice appear more or less expected, because what in the 1st century BC is still can be still a necessary option. In the 2nd century AD, after Catullus and Martial especially, looks like crossing the boundary backwards. The remaining epigrams do not show any direct connection with Greek epigram, so subgenre is not sufficient to explain the language choice. Let's look at them briefly. Most of the dedicatory epigrams, which are numbers 4, 8, 9, are ascribed to Hadrian, and most of them are inscriptions. Their original settings are supposed to have been in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. So, in such cases, the purpose of fulfilling the expectations of the intended readers may have been the principal factor decisive for the language choice. A bit different is the case of epigram 11, Tiberius' epigram, which is, on the contrary, a fictional dialogue with the deceased Hector as a pretext for celebrating the glory of Rome as a reviving Troy, raised up again by the descendants of Aeneas. It contains a message for Achilles and the Greeks beyond him in the last part of the text, a message of revenge upon Greece. Well, Greek language cannot be used by chance in this text. Epigram 6 is the poetic version of an anecdote. In particular, this anecdote involves a sick and starving man of letters, Musikon, in line 2, who addresses the emperor in Greek and might have been Greek himself. So the emperor's answer is unsurprisingly in Greek too. Among the motives behind the choice of Greek by Roman authors, we cannot overlook those concerning the authors themselves. Our authors are very special authors. Most of them, as I said, as you have seen, are emperors and members of the imperial family. So the political role of the authors necessarily gives a political value to the language choice. And the attitude of the emperors towards Greek culture and language influenced, of course, the feelings of the Romans towards Greekness. To conclude, we have found Greek epigrams at the core of the Roman literature and empire, from the 1st century BC to the 2nd AD, down to Martial and beyond. In most cases, subjects and subgenres show a direct connection to the Greek epigrammatic tradition and can explain the choice of language. But these epigrams, the epigrams examined, belong to different stages in the literary history, both before and after Martial's seminal experience. So they mark a development from a feeling of competition, so to say, which entails the effort of translating the Greek models into Latin. See Germanicus, for example, but also Horace's text that we have read at the beginning. So a development from a feeling of competition to one of unity, which implies that Greek culture and language belonged to the Roman Empire. Let me remind you of Suetonius' account, according to which the Emperor Claudius addressed a foreigner who was both Greek and Latin speaker by the words cum utroque sermone nostro sis paratus, since you have come equipped with both our languages. So Greek as well as Latin is here qualified as sermo noster. Nevertheless, despite of Claudius' statement and propaganda, perhaps, this point of view was never entirely shared by the Greeks. In fact, the phenomenon that we have observed, literary bilingualism, so to say, is not bilateral. It doesn't work in both ways. I mean that we can hardly find poets of Greek extraction composing Latin verses. In the light of all these, I I think we can claim that writing Greek epigrams by Roman authors is never an expected or insignificant choice, both before and after Catullus and Martial. The authors look at the Greek epigram as a model and keep feeling its superiority in this respect. Language shift marks, in other words, cultural and political tensions. So, using Adam's categories in a deliberately misleading way, we can conclude that literary bilingualism, in the field of epigram at least, exists only as a dominant bilingualism. Thank you very much for your attention.